God's love for the people of northern Israel was like that of a father for his child. It was a deep, unending love. He did not love them because they were perfect. He did not love them because they always followed his ways. In fact, they often wandered far from him. They built idols of gold and stone. They worshipped things made by human hands instead of the God who made their hands. Yet his love remained. It was a patient love, a hopeful love. He saw not just who they were, but who they could be. He remembered the promise he made to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was a promise to be their God, and for them to be his people. This covenant was like a golden thread woven through their history, a constant reminder of his presence and his commitment. Think of a shepherd watching over his flock. The sheep may stray, they might get lost in dark valleys or wander toward dangerous cliffs. The shepherd does not abandon them. He goes after the lost one. He calls out its name. He searches until it is found. This is how God saw northern Israel. They were his flock, and he was their shepherd. Every time they turned away, his heart ached. He longed for them to return to the safety of his care. His love was not based on their performance but on his character. He is a God of grace, a God of second chances, and a God who never gives up on his own. He wanted to protect them, to guide them, and to bless them with peace and prosperity in the land he had given them. This love was demonstrated in countless ways. He gave them a beautiful land, a land flowing with milk and honey. He gave them laws to live by, not to burden them, but to create a just and compassionate society. These laws were a gift, a blueprint for a life of purpose and harmony. When they were hungry, he provided food. When they were in danger, he sent rescuers. His love was active and present in their daily lives, even when they failed to see it. He sent rain for their crops and sun to warm their fields. Every good thing they had came from his hand. He was the silent provider, the unseen guardian, always working for their good, even when they gave the credit to lifeless idols. Most importantly, God's love was a pursuing love. He did not sit silently in heaven and watch them fail. He actively reached out to them. He sent messengers, men with fire in their hearts and words of truth on their lips. These were the prophets. They were God's voice, his tears, his plea. They were sent to remind the people of who they were and whose they were. They were sent to call them back home. The existence of these prophets is the ultimate proof of God's unwavering love. He could have turned away. He could have said enough, but he didn't. He kept sending help. He kept offering a way back. His love was relentless, a steady beacon in the growing darkness of their disobedience. God sent many prophets to speak to the people of northern Israel. These men were his chosen mouthpieces, brave souls who stood before kings and commoners alike. One of the first and most powerful was Elijah. He was a man of the wilderness, rugged and bold. His message was simple and direct: the Lord is the one true God. Elijah challenged the 450 prophets of the false god Baal on Mount Carmel. He called on God, and God answered with fire from heaven. This dramatic event was a wake-up call, showing the people the powerlessness of their idols and the supreme power of the God of their fathers. Elijah's work was to turn the hearts of the people back to true worship, away from the empty rituals they had adopted from their neighbors. After Elijah was taken to heaven in a whirlwind, his work was continued by his successor, Elisha. If Elijah was fire, Elisha was water, bringing life and healing. Elisha performed many miracles that showed God's compassionate care for his people. He purified a contaminated spring of water. He multiplied a poor widow's oil so she could pay her debts and save her sons from slavery. He even raised a young boy from the dead. Elisha's ministry was a beautiful picture of God's desire to bless and restore. His actions were not just displays of power, they were acts of love. They showed that God was interested in the small personal needs of his people, not just the grand destiny of the nation. He was a God who cared for the widow and the orphan. Another important voice sent to the north was the prophet Amos. Amos was not a priest or a man from a noble family. He was a simple shepherd and a tender of sycamore fig trees from the southern kingdom of Judah. God called him to go north and speak a difficult message. Amos preached against the social injustice he saw everywhere. The rich were oppressing the poor, the courts were corrupt, the people went through the motions of religious festivals, but their hearts were far from God. Amos's message was a thunderous call for justice and righteousness. He famously declared God's desire: let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. He warned that their comfortable lives would not last if they continued to ignore the needy among them. Then there was Hosea. whose own life became a living parable of God's love for Israel. God commanded Hosea to marry a woman named Gomer who was unfaithful to him. She left him to pursue other lovers, yet God told Hosea to go and buy her back, to love her again. This painful story was a mirror of God's relationship with northern Israel. They had been unfaithful to him, chasing after false gods, yet God's love was like Hosea's. It was a redeeming love that refused to let go. Hosea's message was one of heartbreaking love and a plea for reconciliation. He spoke of God's pain over their betrayal, but also of his deep, abiding promise to heal them and love them freely if they would only return to him. The stream of God's messengers did not end there. Other prophets also raised their voices in the land of northern Israel, each adding a unique note to the chorus of divine warning and invitation. One such prophet was Jonah. While his main mission was famously to the foreign city of Nineveh, his story was a powerful lesson for Israel. Jonah himself was from the northern kingdom. When God told him to go and preach to Israel's enemies, the Assyrians, Jonah ran away. He could not understand why God would show mercy to such a wicked nation. His reluctance mirrored Israel's own spiritual pride and their failure to be a light to the nations as God had intended. The story showed that God's compassion extends to all people, a lesson Israel needed to learn. Another prophet who spoke during this time was Micah. Although he preached primarily in the southern kingdom of Judah, his words often included warnings for the northern kingdom, which he called Samaria. Micah saw the same problems that Amos did: corruption, greed, and the oppression of the poor. Leaders were taking bribes, and the wealthy were stealing land from the common people. Micah's message was sharp and clear. He condemned the sins of the capital cities, both Samaria in the north and Jerusalem in the south. He famously summarized what God truly wants from his people: to act justly and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. This simple, powerful statement cut through all the empty religious ceremonies and pointed to the heart of true faith. We also hear the voice of a prophet named Oded. His story is a brief but beautiful glimpse of prophetic influence. After the northern kingdom of Israel won a great victory over the southern kingdom of Judah, they took 200,000 of their own kinsmen as captives. Oded went out to meet the victorious army. He bravely told them that their victory was from God, but that their plan to enslave their brothers and sisters from Judah was a great sin. He warned them that God's anger would be upon them if they did not release the captives. His words struck a chord with some of the leaders of northern Israel. They listened, and they not only released the prisoners but also clothed, fed, and cared for them before sending them home. It was a rare moment of obedience. These prophets, along with others whose names might be lost to history, formed a chain of divine communication. They were God's ambassadors, sent to a court that did not want them. They spoke of judgment, but always with a background of hope. They warned of destruction, but always with an offer of escape. Their messages were consistent: turn from your idols, care for the poor, live justly, and return to the God who loves you. They were like watchmen on a city wall, shouting warnings of an approaching enemy. The people of northern Israel heard the shouts. The question was whether they would listen and prepare, or ignore the warnings and face the devastating consequences of their choices. After the death of King Solomon, the nation of Israel split into two. The 10 tribes in the north formed their own kingdom, which we call Northern Israel. Over its history, a total of 19 kings sat on its throne. This long line of rulers began with a man named Jeroboam. He was afraid that his people would travel south to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, and that their hearts would turn back to the king of Judah. To prevent this, he made a fateful decision. He set up 2 golden calves, one in the north at Dan and one in the south at Bethel, and told the people, "Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." This act of creating false worship centers became the original sin of the northern kingdom, a spiritual poison that infected nearly every king who followed. Out of these 19 kings, the sad truth is that not a single one is described in the Bible as being wholly good or righteous in God's eyes. The pattern set by Jeroboam was followed with startling consistency. Each new king, whether he came to power through inheritance or by a violent coup, did evil in the eyes of the Lord and followed the ways of Jeroboam. The prophets came and went, pleading and warning, but the hearts of the kings were hard. A particularly wicked example was King Ahab, who, influenced by his foreign wife Jezebel, promoted the worship of Baal on a national scale. He persecuted God's prophets, like Elijah, and led the nation into deep idolatry. His reign represents the lowest point of northern Israel's spiritual decline. There were moments, brief flickers of hope, when a king seemed to listen, at least partially. King Jehu was one such ruler. He was anointed to carry out God's judgment on the house of Ahab. He acted decisively, destroying Ahab's family and eradicating Baal worship from the land. He tore down the temple of Baal and put an end to its priests. For this, God promised that his descendants would sit on the throne for 4 generations. However, even Jehu failed to complete the reformation. The Bible tells us that Jehu was not careful to keep the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit. The golden calves at Bethel and Dan remained. The story of these kings is a tragic one. It is a story of missed opportunities and stubborn rebellion. They had the law of Moses. They had the living voices of the prophets in their courts. They had the history of God's faithfulness to their ancestors. Yet they chose power over piety, convenience over covenant. Each king added another layer of sin and disobedience, leading the nation further down a path of self-destruction. Their failure to lead the people in righteousness created a society ripe for judgment. They were the shepherds who led the flock astray, the captains who steered the ship of state directly into the storm, ignoring the lighthouse warnings sent by God himself. Among the 19 kings of northern Israel, there was one who came closer than most to genuine repentance, yet his story also ends in failure. This was King Joash, also known as Jehoash. He was the grandson of the great reformer, Jehu. During his reign, the prophet Elisha was very old and near death. King Joash went to visit the dying prophet and he wept over him. He cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." This was a sign of great respect. It showed that Joash understood the vital role Elisha had played as the true protector and spiritual strength of the nation. It was a moment of rare humility for a king of Israel, acknowledging his dependence on God's prophet. Elisha, even on his deathbed, had one final prophecy for the king. He instructed Joash to take a bow and some arrows. He told the king to shoot an arrow out the east window, declaring it to be the Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram. Then, Elisha told the king to take the remaining arrows and strike the ground with them. This was a symbolic act. The number of times he struck the ground would represent the number of times he would defeat the Aramean army, Israel's great enemy at the time. It was a test of the king's faith and zeal. The opportunity for a complete and total victory was placed directly into his hands by the prophet of God. Here, in this crucial moment, King Joash faltered. He struck the ground only 3 times and then stopped. The dying prophet was angry with him. Elisha told him, "You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times, then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. But now you will defeat it only 3 times. Joash listened to the prophet, but his response was half-hearted. He showed some faith, but not enough. He was willing to obey, but only up to a point. His actions revealed a lack of passionate commitment to God's plan. He would receive a partial victory, a limited blessing, because his faith was limited. The story of King Joash is a powerful illustration of why northern Israel ultimately failed. Even when a king showed a glimmer of hope and a willingness to listen, the obedience was incomplete. The commitment was not total. Like his grandfather Jehu, who destroyed Baal worship but kept the golden calves, Joash obeyed the prophet's instructions but without the fierce passion required for total victory. It shows that partial obedience is still disobedience. The cancer of idolatry and half-hearted faith was so deep within the nation's leadership that even the best of them fell short. They were always holding something back, never fully surrendering to God's will, and this spiritual compromise ultimately sealed their fate. Even as northern Israel spiraled downward, God was not without a plan. His immediate plan was to call his people back to himself through the prophets. He desired their repentance so that he could heal their land and they could remain as his people in his promised territory. This was Plan A, the open invitation for them to return. But God, in his infinite wisdom, always has a deeper, more far-reaching plan. He knew their hearts. He knew their stubbornness. He knew that his judgment on their rebellion would eventually have to come. Yet this judgment was not the end of the story. Woven into the prophet's warnings was a whisper of a future hope, a different kind of salvation. This other plan was not about saving the political kingdom of northern Israel, it was about saving a remnant of people for himself. Throughout the Old Testament we see this theme of the remnant. Even in the midst of widespread apostasy there were always a faithful few who did not bow their knees to Baal. Elijah felt he was all alone, but God told him there were 7,000 in Israel who had remained faithful. God's plan was to preserve this remnant, this seed of faithfulness, through whom his ultimate promises could be fulfilled. The prophets spoke of a day when God would gather his scattered people, not just from the north or south, but from all the corners of the earth where they would be dispersed. The prophets, especially Hosea, spoke of this future redemption in beautiful terms. After describing Israel's unfaithfulness and the coming judgment, Hosea speaks God's words of promise. "I will heal their waywardness and love them freely." He speaks of a day when Israel will be betrothed to God forever in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. These promises looked beyond the corrupt kings and the crumbling nation. They pointed to a new covenant, a relationship based not on the people's ability to keep the law, but on God's grace and forgiveness. This was a plan that could not be thwarted by human failure because it was based entirely on God's own faithfulness. This ultimate plan of salvation would find its fulfillment in a person, not a place. The prophets began to speak more and more of a coming king, a Messiah from the line of David. While this promise was more directly connected to the southern kingdom of Judah, it was a promise for all 12 tribes of Israel. This future king would succeed where all the kings of the north had failed. He would be perfectly righteous. He would rule with perfect justice. He would gather the scattered sheep of Israel and be their true shepherd. This was God's ultimate rescue mission. It was a plan to save his people not just from foreign armies, but from the sin that was the root of all their problems through the coming of his Son, Jesus Christ. The end for northern Israel came just as the prophets had warned. For over 2 centuries they had ignored the pleas of God. They had filled the land with idols, injustice, and immorality. The patience of God, though incredibly long, finally came to an end. The agent of his judgment was the mighty and ruthless Assyrian Empire. For years Assyria had been growing in power, conquering nation after nation. The kings of northern Israel tried to fend them off through political alliances, and by paying large sums of money as tribute. But these were merely temporary solutions. They were trying to solve a spiritual problem with political tools, and it was doomed to fail. The final siege began around the year 725 BC. The Assyrian king, Shalmaneser V, marched his formidable army into northern Israel and surrounded its capital city, Samaria. Samaria was a well-fortified city, built on a hill, and it held out for 3 long years. We can only imagine the suffering inside the city walls during that time. There would have been starvation, disease, and despair. The people who had once lived in luxury, ignoring the warnings of Amos, were now trapped. The false gods they had trusted were silent. The golden calves at Bethel and Dan offered no protection. The nation that had begun with such promise was now breathing its last, gasping for air under the chokehold of the Assyrian army. In 722 BC, the city of Samaria finally fell. The Assyrians poured through its broken walls and showed no mercy. The kingdom of northern Israel, which had stood for just over 200 years, was completely destroyed. Its land was seized, its cities were ruined, and its national identity was erased. The Bible is very clear about why this happened. It was not because the Assyrian army was simply stronger. It was because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God. They worshipped idols. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors, and the statutes he had warned them to keep. The fall of the kingdom was the direct and tragic consequence of their persistent rebellion. The Assyrians had a specific policy for conquered peoples, designed to prevent any future uprisings. They would deport the influential and skilled people from their homeland, and scatter them throughout the vast Assyrian Empire. In their place, they would bring in foreigners from other conquered lands. This is precisely what happened to northern Israel. The Assyrian king deported the Israelites to Assyria. They were taken from the land God had given them, the land of promise, and forced into exile. They lost their homes, their freedom, and their connection to the place that had defined them as a people. They became slaves and subjects in a foreign land, their tragic story a somber warning for all time. After the Assyrian conquest, the people of northern Israel were forcibly removed from their land. The Bible tells us they were settled in Hala, in Gozan on the Habur River, and in the towns of the Medes. These locations are in modern-day Syria, Iraq, and Iran. The Assyrians did not keep them together in one large group. They scattered them in different communities across their empire. This was a deliberate strategy to break their national unity and forced them to assimilate into the surrounding cultures. Over time, living among foreign peoples with different languages, religions, and customs, the exiled Israelites began to lose their distinct identity. They intermarried and adopted new ways of life. This dispersal is why the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom are often called the lost tribes of Israel. They were not lost in the sense that God did not know where they were. They were lost to history. They blended into the populations of the Near and Middle East, and their trail grows cold. Unlike the southern kingdom of Judah, which was later exiled to Babylon but largely maintained its identity and was allowed to return after 70 years, the northern tribes never experienced a large-scale, organized return. They were absorbed into the great sea of humanity. Over the centuries, many groups around the world, from Ethiopia to India to Japan, have claimed to be descendants of these lost tribes, but these claims are very difficult to prove historically. The question of where they went is one of history's great mysteries. Some likely assimilated completely and disappeared as a distinct people. Others may have migrated over generations to other lands. Some historians believe that a portion of them may have fled south to the kingdom of Judah before or during the Assyrian invasion, becoming part of the Jewish people. The Bible mentions that some individuals from the northern tribes were present in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. For example, the prophetess Anna, who greeted the infant Jesus in the temple, is identified as being from the tribe of Asher, one of the 10 northern tribes. This shows that not every single person was lost. However, the vast majority of the population was scattered and, for all practical purposes, vanished from the world stage as a distinct entity. They were like seeds thrown to the wind, carried to distant and unknown places. Their story is a sobering reminder of the consequences of turning away from God. They lost their land, their temple, their king, and ultimately their identity as the people of Israel. They became a people without a home, a people defined by what they had lost. The promise God made to them was tied to a relationship, and when they broke the relationship, they forfeited the blessings that came with it. So, did the people of northern Israel ever return? In recent times there has not been a mass return of identifiable descendants of the 10 lost tribes to their ancient homeland. The modern state of Israel, established in 1948, was founded primarily by Jews, who are the descendants of the southern kingdom of Judah, along with the tribe of Benjamin and some Levites. When we speak of Jewish people today, we are mostly talking about the lineage of the southern kingdom, the ones who survived the Babylonian exile and maintained their identity. They are the ones who returned to the land and rebuilt the temple, and whose descendants have returned again in our modern era. The land that was once northern Israel is, of course, a central part of the modern state of Israel. The ancient capital, Samaria, is located in the region often called the West Bank today. Places like Shechem, Shiloh, and the Jezreel Valley, all rich with history from the northern kingdom, are there. The landscape is the same. The hills and valleys that Elijah and Elisha walked are still there, but the population is different. The area is inhabited by both Israelis, meaning Jews, and Palestinians. The descendants of the foreigners whom the Assyrians brought in to replace the exiled Israelites are known as Samaritans, and a very small community of them still lives there today, preserving their own ancient form of the Israelite religion. So, what is the state of Israel like now? It is a vibrant, complex, and modern nation. It is a democracy with a thriving economy, a world leader in technology and innovation. It is also a place of deep religious significance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Jerusalem is its capital, a city sacred to billions. However, it is also a land of conflict and tension, as Israelis and Palestinians both lay claim to the same territory. The peace and security that the prophet said would come from obedience to God remain elusive. The political and social realities of the region are a constant reminder of its complicated and often painful history. But the story is not over. The prophets who foretold the scattering of Israel also foretold a future gathering. The Bible speaks of a day when God will reunite the stick of Judah and the stick of Ephraim, a name often used for the northern kingdom, into one nation. Many people of faith believe this is a promise that is yet to be fully realized. They believe that in God's time, He will seek out and redeem His scattered people from all 12 tribes and bring them into a final perfect restoration under their true Messiah. So, while the people of old northern Israel are not a visible part of the current state, the hope for their ultimate return remains a powerful part of the biblical promise for the future.